When humans say, "Fine, I'll handle it," the galaxy freezes. Part 1. The phrase heard across the stars. The Galactic Concord Assembly was the largest structure ever built by thinking creatures. A station that hung in the empty black between three dead stars, like a pearl floating in nothing. And inside it, 4,000 species argued about the future of everything, while the future burned. Ambassador Keth Voren of the Solhari hegemony had served in that station for 119 standard cycles. And in all that time, he had never once raised his voice, never once lost his composure, and never once felt afraid. But that was about to change, because of a human woman he had barely noticed before today. The crisis had a name that nobody used anymore, because names made things feel manageable, and this thing was not manageable. But for the record, it was called the Virathi expansion, and what it meant in plain language was that a species of giant insectoids, with acid black shells and 6 blade-tipped arms, had decided that every world within reach belonged to them, and had started taking those worlds with the kind of speed that made diplomats choke on their formal language. 3 colony worlds had already fallen, and fallen was a gentle word for what had actually happened. Because the Virathi did not conquer, they consumed. They stripped worlds bare of resources, and relocated the surviving populations into labor camps that the Concord could not even confirm existed, because every probe sent to investigate never came back. Keth Voren watched the assembly hall with his ancient yellow eyes and felt the familiar weight of uselessness settle over him, like dust. Because the hall was doing what it always did when something terrible happened. It was talking. The Dravani Collective proposed a joint fleet, and the Solhari seconded it, but the Minari Federation vetoed it, because they did not want to risk their ships. Kingdoms abstained, because they were too far away to care. And the Thessan Combine changed their vote 3 times in one session, because their government was run by a committee of 900, and none of them agreed on anything. Meanwhile, a 4th colony fell. This one was different, because this one was called Haven's Rest, and it was a refugee world, a place where mixed species populations lived together under Concord protection. And among its population were 90,000 aliens of various species, and 12,000 humans. And when the Virathi swarm descended on it, the distress signal that came out was 12 seconds long before it cut to static. Keth Voren remembered hearing that signal played in the assembly hall, remembered the silence that followed it, remembered how 4,000 species looked at each other, and then looked away, because none of them wanted to be the first to say what everyone was thinking, which was that Haven's Rest was gone, and those people were probably dead, and nobody was going to do anything about it. He also remembered looking across the hall at the human delegation and seeing something he did not understand at the time. The humans were a small delegation, only 7 people, led by a woman named Elena Vargas Ochoa, who had dark hair pulled back tight, and eyes the color of strong coffee, and a way of sitting very still, that Keth Voren had mistaken for shyness, but was actually something else entirely, something he would later describe in his memoirs as the stillness of a creature deciding whether or not to become dangerous. For weeks, the humans had said almost nothing. They had voted when required, and submitted their proposals through proper channels, and attended every session, and sat in their seats, and watched, and because they were small and new, and their fleet was modest, and their territory was barely a speck on the galactic map, nobody paid them any real attention. After the Haven's Rest signal played, the assembly erupted into the usual chaos, delegates shouting over each other, proposals flying like thrown knives, none of them sharp enough to cut anything. And in the middle of it all, Elena Vargas Ochoa stood up. She did not shout. She did not slam her fist on the podium. She did not make a dramatic gesture of any kind. She simply stood and waited, and one by one the delegates near her noticed and fell quiet, and that quiet spread outward like a ripple in still water. until 4,000 species were looking at a single human woman, standing in a hall built for giants. She spoke one sentence, and it was translated simultaneously into 4,000 languages, and it hit every ear, and every audio receptor, and every vibration-sensitive membrane in that room, at the same moment. "Fine, I'll handle it." Then she turned and walked out, and her 6 colleagues followed her, and the door closed behind them, with a sound that was very small and very final. Kethvoron sat in the silence that followed, and tried to understand why his hearts were beating faster than they had in decades, because it was just a sentence, just 5 words, spoken by the representative of a species that had only been part of the galactic community for 87 cycles. A species that was considered young and reckless and not particularly important. But something about the way she said it, something about the absolute certainty in her voice, something about how she did not ask for permission or support or approval, something about how she simply declared that this was now her problem and walked away to solve it. That something crawled under his scales and settled into his bones like cold. He went back to his quarters that night and opened the Solhari historical database and typed in humanity, and then narrowed the search to military responses to provocation, and what he read kept him awake for 3 days. About a species that had crawled out of mud and gravity and radiation, and built ships out of stubbornness, and reached the stars smelling like iron and sweat, and something the database could only translate as defiance. And everywhere they went, they carried a peculiar trait that no other species seemed to share, a trait that the database described in clinical language, but that Kethvoron understood in his gut as something far more primal. When humans said they would handle something, they meant it, and they did not stop until it was handled. And the galaxy had learned this lesson several times before, but apparently not well enough, because the Virathi had just made the mistake of hurting humans, and the humans had just said the words. Across the galaxy, in intelligence offices and war rooms and the private chambers of species old enough to remember what those words meant, something began to happen that had no name in any language, but could be described simply as this. Galaxy held its breath, not because of the Virathi, because of what was coming for them. When humans say, "Fine, I'll handle it," the galaxy freezes. Part 2. The Doctrine of Disproportionate Response. 7 days after Elena Vargas Ochoa walked out of the Galactic Concord Assembly, a meeting took place 300 meters beneath the surface of Olympus Mons on Mars, in a room that did not officially exist, and in that room sat 11 people who were about to decide the shape of the next 100 years of galactic history. Fleet Admiral Kofi Asante sat at the head of the table with his hands folded in front of him, and his expression so calm that a stranger might have thought he was about to discuss the weather. But the people in that room were not strangers, and they knew that the calmer Kofi Asante looked, the more dangerous the situation was. And right now, he looked like he was carved from stone. Elena sat to his left, and she had not slept in 4 days, and it showed in the shadows under her eyes, but not in her voice, because her voice was steady when she laid out the situation in terms that left no room for comfortable interpretation. The Concord had not sanctioned military action. No allied species had pledged ships or support. The Virathi controlled 6 systems and were expanding into a 7th. The refugee population on Haven's Rest was alive, but being used as labor. And humanity's total combat fleet consisted of 42 warships of various classes, which was roughly 1/10 the size of the Virathi swarm armada. When she finished, a general named Torres leaned forward and asked the question that everyone was thinking. Do we have enough? Asante looked at him, and the ghost of something that was not quite a smile crossed his face. We never have enough. We always manage. That sentence would have confused any alien who heard it, but every human in the room understood it perfectly, because it was not a statement of arrogance. It was a statement of history. Humanity had never once, in its entire existence, gone into a fight with everything it needed, and humanity had never once failed to find a way, regardless. What followed was 4 hours of planning that would later be studied in military academies across 300 worlds. But before we get to what the humans planned, it is important to understand why the galaxy was already afraid. Because this was not the first time a human had said those words, and meant them. 32 years before this meeting, a pirate coalition called the Krail Syndicate had intercepted a human freighter called the Santa Maria in neutral space. They had killed 3 crew members during the boarding and taken the remaining 19 hostage and demanded a ransom of rare minerals that was roughly equal to the annual budget of a small colony. The human government did not negotiate. They did not even respond to the ransom demand. Instead, a woman named Captain Diane Okoye, who commanded a patrol frigate in the area, sent a single message to Fleet Command that read, "I will handle this," and then she went dark. 11 days later, the Krail Syndicate ceased to exist, not as a political entity, not as a military force, but as a concept. Every base destroyed, every ship disabled or captured, every financial account frozen, every ally and associate identified and presented with evidence of their involvement and given exactly one chance to cooperate. The 19 hostages were recovered alive from the Syndicate's headquarters on a frozen moon. And Captain Okoye's after-action report was 6 pages long, and written in a tone so flat and professional that it somehow made the whole thing more terrifying. Total Krail casualties were estimated at over 40,000. Human casualties were 14 wounded and 0 killed, and the galactic community looked at the math and felt something cold move through them. Because the response was so far beyond proportional that it required a new word, and the word the Solharai coined for it, translated, roughly to, the doctrine of making sure nobody ever tries this again. 26 years before that, the Thessan Combine had blockaded a human agricultural colony during a famine season because of a trade dispute over grain tariffs, and the humans had sent a diplomat to negotiate, and the Thessan had turned the diplomat away, and the diplomat had said something that was recorded and would later become famous. She said, "Very well, we will resolve this ourselves." Within 3 weeks, the humans had broken the blockade without firing a lethal shot, occupied 3 Thessan trade hubs with marine forces who were terrifyingly polite, reverse-engineered every piece of Thessan technology they could find, returned the trade hubs once the blockade was lifted, and sent the Thessan government a bill for the cost of the operation, along with a formal note that said, "We trust this will not happen again." The Thessan economy never fully recovered, not because the humans had destroyed anything, but because the humans had learned everything, and a species that knows your secrets is a species you can never have power over again. These stories, and dozens like them, were why Kephoron could not sleep, and why intelligence agencies across the galaxy were running probability models that kept spitting out results their operators refused to believe. Because the models all said the same thing, which was that a species of 7 billion soft-skinned primates from a heavy-gravity death world with a modest fleet and no allies was about to go to war with the largest active military force in the quadrant. And the models predicted that the humans would win, and they would win in a way that would change everything. Back in the room, beneath Olympus Mons, Admiral Asante stood and activated a holographic display that filled the air with light. And within that light was a plan that had no name yet, but would soon be called Operation Quiet Sun. Plan. It was something worse. It was a complete strategic architecture for dismantling an entire civilization's ability to function. And it used tools that the galaxy had never seen humans deploy. Autonomous swarm drones, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, built in secret over the past decade, in shipyards hidden inside hollowed-out asteroids. Cyber warfare systems designed to infiltrate and corrupt hive-mind communication networks. Psychological operations calibrated specifically for a species that depended on constant connectivity to maintain sanity. Torres looked at the plan, and then looked at Asante, and said, "This is not a war. This is surgery." Asante nodded. "That is the point. We are not going to fight them. We are going to take them apart, and then we are going to put them back together the way we want." Far away in the Virathi core systems, the Queen Admiral of the Virathi expansion fleet received a report that a small human fleet had departed Sol system, heading in the general direction of Virathi space. And she looked at the size of the fleet and laughed, a sharp clicking sound that her species made when something was beneath consideration. Her chief strategic analyst, a quiet male named Vreth, who had spent years studying alien species, placed a document on her war table and told her she should read it. And she asked what it was, and he said it was a compiled history of human military responses to provocation. She pushed it aside and told him to focus on real threats. Vreth returned to his quarters that night and began quietly packing a personal evacuation bag, because he had read the document himself, and he knew something that his queen did not yet understand. The humans were not coming to fight a war. They were coming to end one. When humans say, "Fine, I'll handle it," the galaxy freezes. Part 3. The Silence Before. 3 weeks into Operation Quiet Sun, and nobody had fired a single shot. And that was the part that scared the galaxy most of all. Kef Vorin sat in his quarters aboard the Concorde station, and stared at a tactical map that updated in real time, and watched something he had no frame of reference for, because in 400 years of life and 119 years of diplomatic service, he had seen wars begin and he had seen wars end, but he had never seen a species take apart an enemy the way a child takes apart a toy, carefully and curiously, with total attention to how each piece connected to every other piece. The Virathi expansion fleet controlled 6 star systems, and commanded over 400 warships, and had ground forces numbering in the millions, and by every measurable standard, they were one of the most powerful military forces in the quadrant. 3 weeks, the humans had not destroyed a single one of those ships, or killed a single one of those soldiers. But the Virathi were dying anyway, dying in a way that had no blood. It started with the communications. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reyes sat aboard the human destroyer Oaxaca, in a room full of screens and signals, and she had not slept in what felt like forever. But her hands were steady, and her eyes were clear, because what she was doing required the kind of focus that burned away everything else. And what she was doing was killing an empire with silence. The Virathi were a hive species, not a true hive mind, but something close. They communicated constantly through a dense network of electromagnetic signals layered over chemical pheromone broadcasts. And this network was not just how they talked. It was how they thought. It was how they made decisions. It was how they knew who they were. A Virathi cut off from the network did not just feel lonely, was ceasing to exist. Sarah's team had spent 2 years studying that network, and they had found its weaknesses. Not many, but enough, and now they were exploiting every single one. First, they deployed signal-eating drones, tiny machines no bigger than a human fist that drifted into Virathi space by the hundreds of thousands and attached themselves to communication relays, and did not destroy them, but did something much worse. They introduced a half-second delay into every signal that passed through them, just enough to make the network feel wrong, just enough to make every Virathi feel like the world was slightly out of sync, like a heartbeat that skipped once every few minutes. Then they began cutting specific channels, not all of them, and not randomly, but with surgical precision. They severed the connections between fleet commanders and their sub-hive leaders, between supply ships and their coordination hubs, between ground forces and orbital support. So slowly that by the time the Virathi realized what was happening, the damage was already done. Sub-hive Commander Vreth stood on the bridge of his carrier in the Yithon system and felt the silence growing around him, like water rising in a sealed room. and he was afraid in a way that his species had no word for, because his species had never needed a word for this particular kind of fear. He could still hear some of his soldiers, the ones closest to him, but the broader network was fragmenting. Signals came in broken and strange. Orders arrived that contradicted other orders. Fleet movements made no sense, and worst of all, there were gaps, moments of pure empty nothing, where there should have been the constant warm hum of the hive connection. And in those gaps, Vreth heard something that made his chitin crack with stress. He heard himself, just himself, alone, one mind with no echo, no response, no confirmation that he existed as part of something larger. Creature evolved to be part of a collective. That aloneness was a kind of death that did not require stopping the heart. His soldiers were breaking down around him. Some had stopped responding to commands entirely. Others had turned aggressive and attacked anything that moved. And 3 had begun the self-consumption behavior that Virathi only exhibited in cases of total network severance. They were eating their own limbs, because their bodies had decided that if the hive was gone, then the individual had no reason to remain whole. Vreth tried to contact the Queen Admiral and received nothing. He tried to contact the nearest fleet command and received nothing. He tried to contact anyone anywhere in the Virathi network and received a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Static, empty, and vast, and stretching in every direction like the space between stars. Aboard the Oaxaca, Sarah Reyes watched her screens and tracked the collapse in real time and felt something heavy settle in her chest because she understood what they were doing. They were not just disrupting communications. They were attacking the very thing that made the Virathi a people. And she had to remind herself 3 times that this was necessary, that those people had conquered 4 worlds and enslaved their populations, and that the alternative to this silent war was a loud one that would kill millions. Her commanding officer noticed the look on her face and asked if she was all right, and she said she was fine, which they both knew was a lie, and he said nothing more, because he understood that doing terrible things to prevent worse things was the oldest human burden, and no amount of talking made it lighter. While the Virathi crumbled from within, the humans also deployed the swarm drones against their supply lines, not to destroy cargo ships, but to disable them. Each drone attached to a vessel's engine systems and simply turned them off, leaving the ships intact. And their crews alive, but stranded in space, unable to move or communicate, floating like seeds in still air. Within 2 weeks, the Virathi military machine was starving, not for food, but for information and coordination and purpose. Their fleets drifted without orders. Their garrisons sat in fortified positions, with weapons ready, but no idea who to point them at. Their entire civilization had been built on the assumption that the network would always be there, and the humans had taken the network away without breaking a single thing. At the Concord station, Kethvoron received a private communication from the Minari Federation ambassador, who asked in very careful language whether Kethvoron believed the humans would stop at the Virathi border. He did not know how to answer that question. He received 14 more messages like it over the next 2 days, from 14 different species, all asking the same thing in different words, and he realized that the galaxy was not watching the Virathi collapse with satisfaction or relief. It was watching with terror, because every species in the Concord was now running the same calculation in their heads. If the humans could do this to the Virathi, who had the largest military in the quadrant, what could the humans do to us? Sarah Reyes finished her shift and sat alone in her bunk, and pressed her hands against her face, and breathed slowly, and told herself that tomorrow it would get louder, because Phase 2 was coming, the phase where the fleet moved in, and she knew that what they had done so far was mercy compared to what came next. But she also knew that the Virathi had been given every chance to stop, and they had not stopped. And so now the humans would stop them. Far away in the Virathi command center, the Queen Admiral sat surrounded by her advisors, in a room that should have been alive, with data and signals, and the constant reassuring hum of a connected species. Every screen dark, every channel dead, every link to the outside universe severed, as cleanly as if it had never existed. She had finally read the document that Vreth had placed on her table weeks ago, the history of human responses to provocation. And she understood now what she was facing, and she opened a channel to transmit her surrender. The channel was dead. She tried another, dead, and another, dead, and she stood in the center of her war room, surrounded by the most powerful military officers of the most powerful expansion fleet in the quadrant. And not one of them could send a single signal to the outside universe. In the silence she heard something she had never heard before, because her species was never supposed to hear it, the sound of her own body, the clicking of her joints, the rush of fluid through her veins, the rhythm of her single heart, beating alone with nothing and no one to answer it. She understood then what the humans had done. Had not attacked her empire. They had made her empire forget it existed. When humans say, "Fine, I'll handle it," the galaxy freezes. Part 4, The Hammer Falls. 5 weeks after Elena Vargas Ochoa said 5 words and walked out of the Galactic Concord Assembly, the human fleet crossed into Vyrathi space, and the war that was already over became official. Admiral Kofi Asante stood on the bridge of the carrier Pachamama and watched the stars shift on his tactical display, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The planning was done. The preparation was done. The silent war had hollowed the enemy from the inside, like water rotting wood. And now all that remained was the part where humans walked in and took back what belonged to everyone. The fleet was 42 ships, a number that would have been laughable against a functional Vyrathi war machine. But the Vyrathi war machine was no longer functional. It was a body with no nervous system, muscles with no brain to command them, and the humans moved through it like surgeons, moving through a patient who was already under anesthesia. The first engagement happened at the Korath system, where a Vyrathi defense garrison of 30 ships held orbit around a conquered mining world, and when the human vanguard dropped out of faster-than-light travel, the garrison tried to respond. And that was when the galaxy learned what the humans had truly accomplished during those 3 weeks of silence. The Vyrathi defense platforms opened fire and hit each other, their targeting systems corrupted so deeply that they could no longer tell friend from enemy. 2 platforms destroyed themselves in the first 40 seconds, 3 more fired on their own garrison ships, and the rest simply powered down because their operating systems had received a shutdown command that appeared to come from the Queen Admiral herself, but had actually been generated by a human cyber warfare team operating from a ship that was still 2 systems away. The garrison fleet tried to form a combat formation and failed because formation flying required constant network coordination, and there was no network. Ships drifted into each other's firing lines, collided at low speed, spun in confused circles, as their crews received contradictory orders from systems that had been turned against them. The human destroyers moved through the chaos without firing a single shot for the first 11 minutes. They simply waited and watched as the Vyrathi defeated themselves. And when it was over, and the garrison was a drifting field of disabled and confused ships, the humans broadcast a single message on every frequency. Power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. You will not be harmed. Keth Voren watched the battle footage from the Concord station and felt his scales go cold, because it was not a battle. It was a demonstration, a quiet and terrible proof of what happens when a species that fights with passion and fury decides instead to fight with patience and precision. The pattern repeated across every system. At Vyrathi Prime, the orbital defense grid turned itself off 2 hours before the human fleet arrived, because the malware planted in its systems had been waiting for exactly this moment. At the Ithon system, Subhive Commander Vreth ordered his remaining ships to stand down without a fight, because he had watched 3 other garrisons tear themselves apart, and he was tired and afraid and alone in his own head for the first time in his life, and he wanted it to stop. The ground operations were where the galaxy truly lost its ability to understand humanity. Human Marines landed on the 4 conquered colony worlds in dropships that hit atmosphere like thrown stones, fast and hard and loud, and they came down armed and armored and ready for the worst. And what they found was a Virathi occupation force that had largely stopped functioning. On Haven's Rest were the 12,000 human refugees and 90,000 alien. Refugees had been held for weeks. The Marines breached the labor camp perimeter at dawn and moved through it with the kind of efficiency that comes from training and rage held under absolute control. Period. They found Virathi guards sitting motionless in their posts, starving because their supply network had collapsed, disconnected from each other and from command. Some of them so deep in isolation psychosis that they did not react when the Marines entered. Others fought, and the Marines responded with non-lethal suppression where possible, stun rounds, and restraint systems, and gas that put the insectoids to sleep without killing them. And when they found Virathi guards sitting motionless in their posts, starving because their supply network had collapsed, disconnected from each other and from command, some of them so deep in isolation psychosis that they did not execute it. They arrested it, they restrained it, and documented the evidence, and marked it for trial, and moved on to the next objective with the same professional calm that they brought to everything. They had every reason to kill. They had rage enough to burn that camp to the ground, with every Virathi in it. The galaxy knew what humans were capable of when they were angry, because the galaxy had read the same history files that Kethvorin had read. And yet these humans chose restraint. Not because they were weak, not because they lacked the capacity for violence, but because they had decided, before they ever set foot on that world, that they would be better than what had been done to their people. And that decision had been made not in the heat of the moment, but in the cold planning rooms beneath Olympus Mons, where Asante had looked at his officers and said, "We will show them what we are, and what we are is not them." Kethvorin understood this, and it terrified him more than any massacre would have, and he tried to explain why to his young assistant. Understand why mercy was frightening. "Any species can destroy," he said. "Destruction is easy. It is the first tool evolution hands to every creature that crawls out of the mud. But to hold absolute power over a defeated enemy, to have them broken and helpless, and to know that no one in the galaxy would blame you for ending them, and then to choose to feed them and heal them and give them a trial. That requires something that I do not have a word for in my language. It requires a species that knows exactly how far it can go, and has drawn a line, and decided that the line matters more than the satisfaction of crossing it. And that is what makes them terrifying. They are not out of control, they are in total control, and they could at any moment decide to stop being merciful, and the galaxy knows this, and the galaxy cannot do anything about it except hope that they never make that decision." On Haven's Rest, a journalist from the Minari Press Corps found a 6-year-old human girl sitting in the rubble of the camp, eating a ration bar that a Marine had given her. And the journalist asked her if she had been scared, and the girl looked up with eyes that were old beyond her years, and said, "My mom said someone was coming. She said not to worry. She said that is what humans do." The journalist included that quote in her report, and it was translated into 4,000 languages, and it broke the hearts of species that did not even have hearts. The final act of the military campaign happened in the Queen Admiral's command center, where Asante's face appeared on the screen that the humans had reactivated for this single purpose. And the Queen Admiral stood surrounded by her generals, who had each already individually surrendered, through channels the humans had quietly restored, one at a time, picking her officers away from her, like pulling threads from a cloth. She was the last, alone in a way that her species was never meant to experience. at the human on the screen and said, "We did not know what you were." Asante looked at her for a long time, and his face showed nothing, not anger, not triumph, not pity, just the steady calm of a man who had done what needed to be done, and would carry the weight of it for the rest of his life. "No one ever does," he said, and the war was over. When humans say, "Fine, I'll handle it," the galaxy freezes. Part 5. The Weight of 3 Words. 6 months after the Virathi expansion ended, Elena Vargas Ochoa walked back into the Galactic Concord Assembly, and this time, every eye in the chamber was on her, before she even reached her seat. She looked different, and everyone could see it. She was thinner, and there were lines on her face that had not been there before, and her eyes carried a weight that the older species recognized, because they had seen it in their own leaders after wars. The weight of decisions that saved thousands and cost hundreds, and could never be fully justified, no matter how many times you ran the numbers. The session was supposed to be a formal review of humanity's unilateral military action, and half the delegations had come prepared to condemn, and the other half had come prepared to quietly support. And what happened instead was something that none of them expected. Collective opened with a motion to censure humanity for acting without Concord authorization, and 20 species seconded the motion. And the debate that followed was fierce and ugly. Delegates called the human action reckless and dangerous, and a violation of the cooperative principles that held the galaxy together. And they were not entirely wrong, and everyone knew it, including Elena. The Minari ambassadors stood and spoke for an hour about the precedent this set, about what it meant when a single species decided it had the right to wage war on behalf of everyone without asking permission, about how this kind of unilateral power was exactly what the Concord had been built to prevent. When he finished, Elena stood and the chamber went quiet in a way that it never had before for any human delegate. Not the polite quiet of courtesy, but the deep quiet of 4,000 species holding their breath, because they had seen what this woman's words could set in motion. And her voice was steady, but not strong. It was the voice of someone who was very tired and very honest, and had decided that this was not the moment for performance, but for truth. 6 months ago, I stood in this chamber and listened to you argue, while people died. Not my people, all of our people, 90,000 of your citizens, and 12,000 of mine, held in camps on a world that this body had promised to protect. And I listened to proposals and vetoes, and amendments and abstentions, and I watched the number of fallen worlds go from 3 to 4, and I knew that if I sat back down, it would go to 5, and then 6, and then however many it took, before someone in this room found the courage to act. She paused and looked around the chamber, and met the eyes of delegates who would not meet hers. So I said 5 words, and I walked out, and I am not sorry for that. I cannot be sorry for that, because those 5 words saved 102,000 lives. Carry the cost of what we did to save them, for the rest of mine. But I will not apologize for it. The chamber shifted and she continued. But I did not come here today to defend what we did. I came here to make sure it never has to happen again, because you are right. One species should not have to carry this alone. One species should not have to make these decisions for everyone. And the fact that we had to, the fact that we were forced to, because this body could not act, that is not a human failure. That is a failure that belongs to every single one of us. She took a breath. You may fear those 3 words. Fine, I will handle it, and I understand why, but I want you to understand what they really mean. They do not mean that we think we are better than you. They do not mean that we want power over you. They mean that we have not given up on you. They mean that we still believe this galaxy is worth fighting for. They mean that when everything falls apart, and nobody knows what to do, we will stand up, not because we are stronger, not because we are smarter, but because someone has to, and if no one else will, then it will be us. And what I am asking you today is to make sure that next time it does not have to be just us." She stopped speaking, and the silence that followed was the kind that changes things. The kind that sits in a room and presses against every wall until something gives. The Orani delegate stood first, a tall crystalline being that had not spoken once during the entire Vyrathi crisis, and it raised one of its resonance limbs in the ancient gesture of recognition that predated every civilization in the room. And then the Minari ambassador stood, the same one who had just spent an hour condemning humanity, and he raised his hand in the same gesture. And then another delegate, and another, until 4,000 species were standing in silence, for a woman who had done a terrible and necessary thing and had come back, not to celebrate it, but to make sure it never had to happen again. The motion to censure was withdrawn, not voted down, but withdrawn, because no one was willing to put their name on it anymore. In the months that followed, humanity was offered a permanent seat on the Concord Security Council, and Elena declined it. Not because she did not want the power, but because she understood that the problem was not who held power, but how power was used. And instead she proposed something that the galaxy had never attempted. She called it the Rapid Response Coalition, a standing force drawn from every willing species, trained together, commanded jointly, designed to respond to exactly the kind of crisis that the Concord had failed to address, so that no single species would ever need to stand alone and say those words again. The proposal passed with the largest majority in Concord history, and the coalition's founding ceremony was held on Haven's Rest on the exact day. Ground where the labor camp had stood, and the camp was gone now, replaced by a memorial and a training facility, and a garden that grew plants from 100 worlds. The coalition's official motto was chosen by a committee, and was something formal and forgettable in a language that no one spoke naturally. But its unofficial motto was chosen by the mostly human founding officers, who painted it on the hull of the first coalition warship in white letters that could be seen from orbit. "Fine, we will handle it." The difference of one word, from I to we, was the whole point. Years later, Keth Voron retired from diplomatic service and began writing his memoirs, and he devoted an entire chapter to that day in the assembly when a human woman said 5 words and walked out, and he titled the chapter, "The Day the Galaxy Learned to Listen." He wrote about the Vyrathi crisis with the careful precision of a historian and the private wonder of someone who had witnessed something that changed the way he understood the universe. And he wrote about humanity with the kind of respect that only comes from fear that has been examined and understood and transformed into something more useful. He noted that in the years after the crisis, the phrase "fine, I will handle it" entered the common language of over 300 species as an idiom, meaning roughly, the moment when someone stops waiting for permission and starts solving the problem. And that it was used sometimes with humor, and sometimes with fear, and sometimes with both at the same time. He noted that the Vyrathi were not destroyed or subjugated, but were instead helped to rebuild their communication networks under a new framework that did not require expansion and conquest to sustain itself, and that the Queen Admiral eventually testified at a reconciliation tribunal and said, "We were a species that could not imagine being alone, and they showed us what alone felt like, so that we would understand what we had done to others," and that this testimony was considered one of the most important documents in galactic legal history. He noted that Elena Vargas Ochoa served 3 more terms as ambassador before retiring to a small house on Haven's Rest, where she grew alien flowers and refused all interviews, and that Admiral Asante returned to Mars and continued playing chess against himself, and never spoke publicly about the war. He noted that Lieutenant Commander Sarah Reyes left military service and became a teacher, and that she sometimes woke at night hearing static, and that she considered this a fair price for what she had done. And he ended his chapter with a paragraph that would be quoted more than anything else he ever wrote in his 412-year life. I have spent 4 centuries watching this galaxy, and in that time I have seen empires rise on the backs of conquest and fall under the weight of their own arrogance. I have seen species discover fire and species forget how to dream. I have seen stars born in clouds of light, and stars die in silence so complete that it bent the fabric of everything around it. But in all those years and all those wonders, I have never encountered anything as terrifying or as beautiful or as stubbornly and irrationally hopeful as a human being who has decided that something is their problem now. They are small and fragile, and they live for barely a century, and they break so easily that it seems like a cruel joke. But when they say they will handle it, the galaxy goes quiet, because the galaxy has learned the hard way that those soft and breakable creatures will walk through fire and darkness and the cold vacuum of space itself before they will break a promise. And I do not know if that makes them heroes or fools, but I know that when the silence comes and nobody else will stand, they will. They always will, and that is enough.